All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Parsha class. Led Zeppelin welcoming, welcoming us in. Okay. So, a couple announcements before we start. The first is I want to tell anyone who is in the Los Angeles area that we're going to have a Hanukkah gathering that I'm very excited about. Rabbi Deborah Sachs-Mintz is going to be here, and we're going to do a kind of a big, like, it's not a concert, although she's a musician who's leading it. It'll be a great kind of singing circle that she's going to lead. And if you came to one that we did with Joey Weissenberg, you have a feeling for that style. And we're going to do one for the seventh night of Hanukkah. So here's the link to that. And I invite everybody in the area or come to the area. It's at the Pico Union Project in downtown LA, which is a beautiful building. And we're just going to sort of sing our way through the penultimate night of Hanukkah, and it should be meditative, and then we'll drink and hang out a little bit afterwards. Okay, so that's one announcement. And then the other announcement is that next week I have a family member who's getting an award, and I'm very proud of her. So I'm going to the award ceremony. But that means I can't come to class. But the great thing about my new kind of operation is that I'm part of this at Hadar. I'm part of this really incredible faculty. I mean, if you like what I do, I'm like the dumbest guy on the totem pole at Hadar. So I'm gonna have next week a great teacher, Rabbi Avi Strasberg, who's actually my supervisor at Hadar. And I'm going to give you a link to her bio here. And she's a great teacher of Torah, and in particular has taught a lot of Eish Kodesh, of like the Pizetzner Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, and may bring some of his Torah next week. So we will have class next week. Rabbi Avi Strasberg is teaching for me, and I highly recommend you come. She's doing, by the way, I'm sending out these weekly Divrei Torah also, which I encourage you to sign up for. And I'm sending them out on the weekly Parsha, and she sends out an essay on every holiday. So we're sort of tag teaming on this, and nice to tag team on the class as well. So anyway, those are announcements. Let's start learning Torah. Okay, what we're gonna do today is to take a look at one particular name that we find in the Torah. And it's actually a name that you are probably familiar with, even though we don't talk about it very often. And you're probably familiar with it because there's probably a temple in your town with this name. Does anyone have a temple Bethel in their town? Everybody's got a temple Bethel in their town, right? Like every city has to have a Reform synagogue called Temple Bethel. And actually, there's one in LA, there's one in West Hollywood, Temple Bethel. And actually, closest to my neighborhood, it's not just, it's very common in Reform synagogues, but closer to my neighborhood, there's also Bethel Lutheran Church. I think they pronounce it Bethel, right? Just one word, right? So that's like, it's a big name. It's a name that Christians and Jews have taken often to mark their place of worship. And why would they take that name? What is so special about that name? Well, we're going to try and figure that out today, but there is an obvious reason why they would take that name. What does Beth El mean? It's Beit El, which means the house, Beit of El, God. Okay, so the house of God, that's a good name for a synagogue. This is the house of God. But it's not just a description, a random description. The name Bethel has roots in the Torah, and they, in a sense, go all the way back to the beginnings of the Jewish story. But it appears in this week's Parsha in a kind of an interlude that I have usually overlooked. And this year I just noticed it and thought, oh my goodness, what's going on here? So that's what we're going to try to figure out. Okay, so let's say a blessing, and then we'll get into our learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, just wanted to do one other thing since I mentioned the Divrei Torah. I thought I would just share with you in case you wanted to sign up for them. I send these out every week, and Rabbi Avi Strasberg, as I said, sends them out too. So chance to get some Torah every week if you're interested. Okay. All right. So let's get started here. Bethel. Now, if you're really like one of my true Torah nerds, then I might ask you, okay, where did we first see Bethel? And we like, I'm sure someone knows the answer here, although that's trivia. We're going to get there, but let's start with where Bethel comes up in this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha is Parshat Vayishlakh. Vayishlakh because and he sent is what it means. Jacob sent out messengers to his brother Esav, and here's what happens at the beginning of this Parsha, and sort of is the build up to this interlude that we're going to focus on. Lots of big dramatic things happening in Jacob's life. After 20 years, he finally leaves Padan Aram, where he's been staying with his uncle and marrying and reproducing and shepherding and just living life in exile. And now he comes back to the land of Canaan, and he encounters he is about to encounter his brother Esav, who is the reason that he fled to begin with, because Esav wanted to kill him because he tricked him out of a blessing and a birthright. That's the famous story of Jacob and Esav. Jacob wrestles with an angel. Jacob meets his brother. They have some kind of they hug and kiss. Lots going on. Then Jacob goes to the city of Shechem. Okay, we'll name some of the cities because we're going to do a little bit of where is this? The city of Shechem, and there has a terrible family tragedy where his daughter is assaulted and presumably raped by one of the local leaders, prince of the town, and it's sort of a double tragedy because his daughter is raped, and then his sons take revenge by slaughtering every male in the town. So it's just, I mean, this is the scene when all of this drama, tragic and hopeful, and just his life, it could not be more intense and more stressful as he's heading back into the land of Israel, of Canaan. And it is when we close the episode of Dinah's assault that, and I'm saying assault not just as a euphemism, but it's unclear what the word vianeha means. Was she raped? Was she tortured? Was she injured? But Dinah is clearly assaulted. At that point, when that episode has closed, suddenly God announces to Jacob, it's time to go back to Bethel. Okay, time to go back to Beit El. So that's where we're going to start. Let's take a look at this scene. And as you'll soon see, like I said, this is a scene that I have not paid much attention to over the years. Okay, here we go. Okay, God's Vayomer Elohim El Yaakov. God said to Jacob, Kum ale Beit El. Get up and go. Arise and go up to Beit El, Vishev Sham, and remain there, and build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esav. Okay, that's the word from God. Go back and it's kind of God speaking in third person here. Appear to the God, presumably that's me, who appeared to you, but especially, when was it? When you were fleeing from your brother Esav. Okay. So, and now here things start to get a little strange right away. Like, what do we make of this next line? So Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, rid yourselves of the foreign gods in your midst, purify yourselves, and change your clothes. Okay? Hasiru et Elokei hanechar. It shouldn't be Elokei, actually. That's it should be Elohei hanechar. We change the sound when it's the name of God, but this is foreign God, so it's not like it's just the lowercase God. We shouldn't. This actually is a mistake. Elohei hanechar asher betochem v'hitaharu v'hachlifu simlotechem. Now, wow, what does this mean? They have foreign gods in their. He's talking to his people. So what foreign gods do they have? That's a little strange. Now, we do have one hint of what that might be, because when Jacob was leaving, his uncle and father-in-law comes and catches up with him and says, "Why are you fleeing from me?" And he searches their camp to see if anything has been taken. And it says that Rachel was sitting on the trafim, the little idols that she had taken from her home. So there is it's not just completely random, but it's a very strange thing for us to hear that Jacob's telling his people, okay, get rid of all the idolatry in our camp. Isn't this Jacob? Isn't this Israel? So that's strange already. And then the other very strange thing that happens, okay, then he repeats sort of the language that God gives him. Let us arise and go up to Beit El, and I will build an altar there to the God who answered me in the day of my distress, who has been with me wherever I have gone. Okay, that's basically the same language. God says, arise and go up. Let us arise and go up. So let's do it. God says to build an altar. I will build an altar. And to the God who appeared to me, to the God who answered me, slightly different language there, but basically the same idea. Okay. They gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had and all the rings that were in their ears, like their jewelry and their idols. Strange. And this, I keep saying strange, but this just keeps getting stranger. And Jacob buried them under the terebinth, under the oak tree that was near Shechem. Terebinth is like such an unused word that I'm just going to change it to oak, under the oak tree. And we're never sure how to translate alone anyway. Okay, so Jacob buried them, all the idols. Now, all the commentators kind of freak out because you're supposed to destroy idols. How could he just bury them? Oh, it must be that they weren't really idols, or maybe they had lost their idolic charge. So this is already confusing to our rabbis. What's going on? He buried them underneath the tree as if somehow like keeping them there or hiding them there. Or I don't know, it's a very strange thing. And then I'm just going to say this one more time. The next line is strange as well. And then as they set out, Vayisahu, Vayichitat Elohim al ha'arim asher Svivotehem. As they set out, a terror from God fell on the cities round about, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Some kind of what is this? A terror, some kind of howling, terrifying force is surrounding Jacob so that he has safe passage. Okay, now let's go to Bethel, or as it is in Hebrew, Beit El. And here it is in the Hebrew, Beit El, the house of God. Okay, thus Jacob came to Luz, that is Beit El, in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him, and there he built an altar and named the site. And here things get really weird, and this is basically where I want to start digging in. He named the site El Beit El. Now, that sounds almost like Dr. Seuss. El Beit El. So if Beit El means the house of God, what does El Beit El mean? El Beit El means the God of the house of God. And he named not the God, but the place, the God of the house of God. Okay, so it's a little like things are getting kind of tongue twisted here, because it was there that God had been revealed to him when he's fleeing from his brother. And then there's another little interlude here that I think we're not going to deal with, but I'll mention it. Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, died and was buried under the oak below Beit El, so it was named Alon Bachut. This is also a strange interlude, and she's also buried underneath the tree. So lots of stuff going on here that it's not so easy to make sense of. But let's just start with the basic movement, going back to Beit El. Why is Jacob going back? Why would Jacob at this moment? Let's just, given the information we've currently put on the table, everything that's happened to Jacob so far, all of the tragedy and the triumph in Jacob's long journey back home, and all of a sudden God says it's time to go back to Bethel. You got to go back to the place, and we know something about it. Maybe now we already remember where we're talking about, but it's the place where God appeared to Jacob when Jacob was fleeing from his brother. So what do we have so far? Why would we go back to that place? Anyone have it? Anyone want to make the connection for us? Noah.
Well, what immediately comes to mind is when Yaakov named the place Beit Elohim in Vayishlakh, and he had the dream with the angels going up and down the ladder. And going back there, it's like that first step for him in becoming the father of the nation, that he's being protected and led by God.
Great. Okay, great. So Noah does the work that for us that I want. I don't want to just throw the answers at us. This is part of what it means to study Parsha, is that when we see a reference like this, we should be thinking, where did we see that before? Where did we see that before? And especially, sometimes we just try to remember parallel language, but here it's explicit. God is saying, go back to the other scene. And so Noah remembers what that scene is. And so we'll follow Noah's lead and go back and take a look at that other scene. And Noah's right. It's the place where Jacob had his dream of the ladder, famous Jacob's ladder dream. So let's take a look at that for a second, because we'll soon see that it's a direct parallel. Okay, it's a direct parallel in all of the language. Though there are, as Noah said, there's some extra language there, but this is our main point of comparison as we begin to think about Bethel. This will give us some. I asked the question: Why is God ordering this? We may have no idea, but once we see what happened, we'll be able to draw more connections. So let's take a look here. We're going to come back to this text. We're in Genesis chapter 35. We're going to come back to that. But let's go take a look where Noah pointed us back in Genesis chapter 28. This was last week's Parsha, when Jacob was just leaving, and he left Beersheba and set out for Haran. And he came upon a certain place and stopped there for the night, for the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he had a dream, and angels going up and down the ladder, and God promises to be with him wherever he goes and protect him and will not leave him until I bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I've done what I've promised to you. Okay, that's significant. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, and this is kind of famous exclamation here, Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh v'anochi lo yadati. God is in this place, and I did not know it. And shaken, he said, Manora makom hazeh. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. Now, Noah said this, and it's true, but it's a little, I want you to just pay attention, because it's a little tricky. The language that Jacob uses originally is Beit Elohim, which is the word that we use for God in this tradition, Elohim. But he ends up calling it Beit El, a shortened version. Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a monument and poured oil on the top of it, and he named the site Beit El. But previously, the name of the city had been Luz. Okay, we saw that before as well, right? We saw that before as well. Where is this? Oh, we haven't seen that yet. But previously, the name of the city had been Luz. Jacob then made a vow saying, if God remains with me, protecting me on this journey that I'm making and giving me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I return safe to my father's house, God will be a God to me. This is a strange moment. A lot of our commentators are confused. What is Jacob makes a vow saying, if God does all these things for me, then God will be a God to me. Sounds like if not, I'm not interested, which is a little surprising coming from one of the forefathers. And this stone, which, okay, now this is the last line that we'll need before we really get into it. And this stone, remember, he set up a stone as a monument. This stone, which I have set up as a monument, this shall be the house of God. And all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. Okay. Now that's strange enough in itself. Jacob has had this incredible experience, and he says, this must be the house of God. This is the gateway to heaven. Unbelievable. I had no idea. And I'll tell you what, if God, you protect me, then and I make it back safely, then you will be a God to me. And I set up this stone, and this stone is the house of God. Now, I could just start there. What does it mean this stone is the house of God? But let's just take the broader question and ask, okay, now that we've seen what happened to Jacob then, why does God want Jacob going back there now? Okay, Sali Amatsui, yeah.
It's a totally different person, the then and the now. Jacob was homeless and desperate with so it makes sense to me that he asked, please provide food, shelter, and clothing for me. In the now, he's a very wealthy man with practically everything that somebody, God made good on his original promise. He's not, for me, he's not asking Jacob to go back. He's asking him to go up, arise, go up to, I mean, you've matured, but not enough to guide your sons to not killing everybody and looting after you've killed all the males in Shechem. So now you might need to go up.
Okay.
The next level.
Okay, so Leah suggests, sort of just delicately suggests two possibilities here. One is that there's a kind of, it's a return to this place as almost as a way of remembering how far Jacob has come, how much has changed, how different everything is. And we do that sometimes, you know, like you go back to your old elementary school and there's something about being in that place. You remember who you were then and who you are now. And the experience of that, just as a touch point, has a kind of psychic impact that's we can imagine in this kind of journey that God might want Jacob to touch back. Remember who you were then and who you are now. But Leah also says, and who Jacob is now is not entirely different. They're still scheming. There's still an element to Jacob's way of living that perhaps maybe you need further elevation. Maybe you need to go back and remember what we were trying to do here, so that the return to Bethel can be an experience of look at how far I've come, or it can be a kind of reminder of how I still have not gotten all the way there. Okay, so this idea of touching base with myself 20 years ago can cut either way. So let's continue to think about that. Matt Silberstein.
I put a link in. There's an essay that suggests that Bethel was an old god. It's a name of an old god, and I almost think what we're seeing here is another place that is an argument for monotheism. It's an argument for the people who still worship. Maybe they worship Elohim, but they also worship others, and saying, let's leave them away. Let's tell the story to go someplace else. to go to monotheism. Oh God, I just had something that dropped out of my head. Maybe it'll appear in 10 seconds. But I think, because it's the rock is a pillar, is a monument to a god, and we've got that, but we've got this other. Oh, that's right. And the other thing, Jacob saying, if you do this stuff for me, that's the reverse of what God says. God is constantly saying, I did these things for you, worship me. And Jacob saying, if you do these things for me, I'll worship you. So again, it's an argument for adopting monotheism. It's an argument for adopting Elohim as your God.
Okay, good. All right. So Matt, very as often as he often does, very helpfully brings in some historical context, or at least some historical theories, and let's, in a simple way, we won't be able to do all of the kind of archaeological review here, but let's just name some of the reference points that Matt is suggesting. So as there is record of a god of the ancient Near East named El, just El, and we in the Torah we use that word just as a word to mean God. And in fact, in the Torah, we are very particular. The first usage of the word God is Elohim, which is a kind of plural version, but we use it as a singular. So our word for God, very polemically, is like a word that means all of the gods are our God. All the gods together, there's a God above God. There's all the forces of the world are one force, okay? So El, just as a singular word, may be a reference to just like the concept of God, but it also may reference a kind of particular understanding of God, or even maybe an idolatrous reference to God. And the more so if there's a God called Bethel, right? So maybe a God that in some other language doesn't mean the house of God, but that's the name of God. Okay, I know this is confusing, but the reason that this is important, and Matt frames it in this way, is that look at all of the worry that Jacob is still carrying idolatry with him. Okay, that Jacob hasn't actually ascended to use Leah's language, gone up and ascended to the understanding of God, the level of God, the relationship with God that we would want or expect of our patriarch. And that, just to add one more kind of layer to this, maybe we worried that all along. Maybe when Jacob was, and I think Matt was going there, when Jacob was making these deals with God, where Jacob says, I'll tell you what, maybe you can be my God. And we're all a little, the tradition is a little bit put off by that. Is Jacob, it's conditional? So all of that suggests maybe Jacob didn't know God as deeply as he might have. Didn't know the God that the Torah is really trying to introduce us to. And though Jacob had a kind of a revelation, there's something he didn't understand. There's something that still needed to be tested. And so maybe the return to Bethel is a kind of a mandate to re-encounter God, to deepen his understanding of a God, to get to a place of some greater, purer relationship with God. Because remember, Jacob has been in a foreign land, living in Aram for the last 20 years, and maybe wasn't so maybe had assimilated in all kinds of ways. Maybe that's why his camp has all kinds of idols hanging around. Okay, so this is like very provocative stuff to say about Jacob, but you can see how the frame of these two scenes and the additional kind of backdrop that Matt provides us, that maybe there are other names of God floating around here. And part of what Jacob is trying to do is sift through and to understand, what's the God of the Torah? What God are we actually making a covenant with? Okay, great. So thank you for all of that. Let's keep going. Yonatan. Oh, Yonatan is like, I'm catching him like building here. This is a great view.
Yes, you're catching me stretching a deer hide. Sorry.
Oh my goodness. For what purpose? Tell
For
us all.
Torah, of course.
Okay, great.
Oh, it's this
Look at
is
that.
I want to say this is from Joshua the deer. Found him as roadkill. And that was a few weeks ago. Now he's fully tanned and just has to dry, and I have to sand him. And then we can write the words of God on him.
Yonatan is involved in this really remarkable project of using, it sounds so like gruesome, but it's actually very holy, of using roadkill for sacred writing so that animals don't have to be killed for it. So just a salute to that project. But please, your thoughts on the Parsha.
Sorry,
with
I
us?
could not hear you over the sound of the garage closing, which I had to close. I trust that everything you said was great.
It was.
But
It was
I
so
wanted
great.
to build. Well, thank you. I'm very touched. I want to build on what Leah said as far as like Jacob's personal growth. God has a kind of fork in the road moment also where for a while God was looking after Jacob out of obligation because God made a promise. I'll look after you until you come back to this place. And so him coming back to this place so that there could be a relationship built out of intention and holiness rather than just obligation was a really important development in his relationship with God.
Good. Okay. So all right. So that's the way that Yonatan puts it. In some ways, takes us to the most precise and simplest, cleanest answer, which is that there is some kind of pledge that is left hanging, and so part of what Jacob is going back to do is to make good on a promise. Right? That's pretty straightforward. Jacob said, if you do all these things, which, maybe we worried he was being a little too presumptuous, but God said, I will protect you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this land. And I'm not going to leave you until I've done what I've promised. And Jacob says, okay, if you protect me and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I return safe to my father's house, that's where Jacob's headed now, back to his father's house, then you will be a God to me. Right? And then this stone which I've set up will be the house of God. So it's sort of like Jacob's like set up this stone, but it's not the house of God yet. It's like Jacob's saying, I will make this a monument to you. I will come back and I will pay tribute to you. But that's just been hanging there in the air for 20 years. So when God says, go back and get back to Bethel and build an altar to the God who appeared to you, God is just saying, no, like, all right, I think I did my part. Now it's time for you to, okay, and now I want to kind of trail off. Now it's time for you to, like, Yonatan's answer is very precise, but in some ways, just what else is there to say? To go back and just say, yep, you sure are a God to me. What does God get from Jacob going back and ta-da, I agree, I acknowledge, right? So there's something there that I want a little more sense of what was so important. What did Jacob pay back there at the end? Okay, let's keep going. Ariella.
Thank you, Rabbi. What I'm thinking is of the imagery of the ladder, that somebody had told me that if we can imagine that ladder is made of glass, that is an analogy for the fragileness of our relationship with El. That it isn't like glass is something that we have to treat reverently, because otherwise it'll shatter into a bazillion pieces.
Okay, all right. That's interesting. I'd never heard the glass idea, but let me just focus in especially on the image of the ladder that Ariel is reminding us of, because that's quite significant here too. And we would be making a mistake not to really consider, as Ariel is doing, the specialness of this place. It seems, right? We saw that it's not just that Jacob's going back to the place where once he was. And it's not just that Jacob has to go fulfill a promise he once made. This is the gateway to heaven. Okay? And when Jacob says, this is the house of God, that's quite a thing to say. Why is this the house of God? Okay, so that's right. The idea that this is, in fact, some kind of portal. Or what's that movie? Stargate. You know that movie Stargate? It's like an old Jeff Bridges movie, I think, where it's just like there's a place in the world, and you can find God in that place. Now, we have a notion, even though, okay, so this gets into tricky Jewish territory, right? We, on the one hand, might think of that as idolatrous. What do you mean there's one place in the world where God is? Isn't the whole point that God is everything and transcends everything? There's no particular place. Or on the other hand, right? This is one of the great sort of dilemmas in our tradition. We have Sion. We have this spot. We have, and in our point in history, we can say what that spot is. It's the temple. It's the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. Now, because of that, that idea that we do have one place that will be called the house of God, where we will have special access to God. So a lot of the commentators, Rashi and the Ramban, are trying to figure out how could this place also be the temple, but it isn't really the temple. I said earlier I was going to show you a map, and I'll do that now. Where I get these maps, by the way, I take no responsibility for where they're just helpful. They're on the internet, but often it's like a weird, I don't know, site like preaching some religion I don't necessarily endorse, but just for the sake of the map. Okay, here's Bethel, right here. Here's this is a strange spelling, but Shechem. Jacob's come from up here, Padan Aram, and he comes down through Shechem to Bethel. And you can see Jerusalem is further south. So it isn't the same thing. At least, like I said, the commentators sort of struggle, to try to make this, because if this is the house of God, then surely they must be talking about Jerusalem. But the whole point being, we have some notion that there are places in the world that provide special access to God, and Jacob stumbled upon one of them. And so now we can import the rest of the conversation we've been having. Maybe he wasn't ready for it then. Maybe he needs to revisit it. Maybe it's the place where you go to make an offering, because just like in later Israelite history, it'll be the place. One way or another, that is the place. This is the house of the Lord, right? Okay, so thank you for that, Ariel. That's an important layer just to think about the gateway to heaven here. All right, Jen.
I think this hits me. Oh, by the way, very happy to be back. I missed this a lot.
Yeah, good to see you, Jen. I almost called it out, but I was like, when's the last time you've been here? Nice to see you.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have Thursdays free again. But I'm influenced, I think, in the way that I think about this, because the non-gendered way of giving a Hebrew name is Mibet, of the house of. So my Hebrew name is like of the house of Abraham and Sarah. So when it's the house of God, to me, it feels like it's very much talking about people. And when I hear the God of the house of God, I think the God that is contained with or carried by or belongs to the people who are God's people. And when Jacob was there before, Jacob was alone. Jacob, and a stone is a very lonely thing and a very lonely metaphor for a thing as well. And now Jacob has all of these people, and Jacob is bringing all of these people to this place that has special access to God. And what I'm getting from that is that like those portals to God, at least within our tradition and at least among God's people who are God's people in this way, has to have people. There have to be people there for that portal to really work and for it to become a temple. That has to be carried around by people before it finds its own place finally. So I think that's what's going on here, is that transformation from like this like lonely dry stone to a group of people or a family of people who are going to make this place meaningful.
That so good to have you back, Jen. That's so well put, and that makes a lot of sense of this moment and the way that this plays out. Jacob has to turn to his whole family and say, okay, we're going now, all of us, because the house of God is a very nice thing. That's nice. You build a house to God. Solomon built a house to God. Question is, will God live in that house? Now, you can build all the houses to God you want, but will God doesn't actually need a home. So will you experience God in a more potent way? And it does seem, and I think Jen put it quite well, it does seem that whatever concept of a house of God we are working with, it involves some kind of large gathering and to a central place. It's not any one of us can just pray to God right now and wherever we are. But if you have a gathering spot, part of what that is for is to bring people together around, just like Temple Bethel. It's a place where people go. So when we see that Jacob is told to get up and go to the house of God, arise and go up and remain there, and Jacob immediately turns to his whole household. Right. And this is Jen picked up on some of this language, right? The house of God here, and then all of Jacob's house. There's a kind of relationship there, right? Like if you're building a place where God can be experienced and it's a house, it's a space. Well, God doesn't really need space. The space is for you to gather to experience God. Okay, so that might be one way of understanding, like the house of God that Jacob sort of set in place was preparatory, but now it's ready to be consecrated. Okay, now it's ready to be consecrated. And here I want to introduce one detail that I said this is new material. I haven't taught this before, so I'm not totally sure where I'm going with any of this. But there is one thing I noticed that I think fits right in with this framework that Jen is giving us. This idea that there's a house of God, but it requires a larger community in order to inaugurate it. As we come up to Hanukkah, we're thinking about the inauguration of the house of God. How do you inaugurate a house of God? What do you do to make it really a house of God? Well, if you follow the template of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, what you do is you make an offering. You make an offering. And that is exactly what God tells Jacob to do, is to make an offering. Go up and build an altar there. And Jacob built an altar there, okay? And Jacob had not built an altar before. Instead, he had built a monument. Okay? Okay, so there's a matzeva, a monument, where he like puts a marker and he says, I've had an experience here. And he consecrates, he pours oil over it. There's something sacred about that, but it hasn't really been actualized as a place of worship. It's just a holding pattern. Not a holding pattern, a marker, just a holding place for what will be the house of God. Okay, and now Jacob is ready, not just personally, but the nation is forming, and it's time to start thinking about where will we go to worship God? Where will we gather together? And that will become a question that becomes increasingly as important as this nation forms. So all of that, very, very helpful. All right, let's turn to David Kurtz. David Kurtz, are you with us?
Yeah, I may be having some internet issues. If I am, just cut me off. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I hear you.
I'm so glad you called me after Jen, because we often think, of our portal and God, our God of Israel, and all those kinds of things. But it's first of all, Jacob has now become Israel. This is where Israel will be. This is Israel's place. I mean, God is not just our God. He's communication with all people. I mean, one of the most profound things later on is we discover that God it makes the tribes go around Edom, the Edomites, which was Esau's land. And God gave that land to Esau. So there's something going on here about he's now become Israel. This is where Israel belongs. This is your place. It's not necessarily like this is the portal to God or something. This is the portal for Jacob's people, for Israel's people.
Good. That's that's beautifully put, and also it leads us so nicely into the message that Jacob gets from God at Bethel when he goes back, which we haven't looked at yet. We were reminded, Noah reminded us that, oh, this must be back at the story of the ladder, so we went back and looked, but we didn't finish the first passage, and it turns out that the first passage is exactly what David is suggesting, is a kind of affirmation of who Jacob has become. Let's go take a look. We're going back to our first text, where God says to get up and go to Bethel, and Jacob goes, and they take all these foreign gods out, and terror protects them, and he builds an altar. And then God appeared to Jacob on his arrival from Padan Aram, and God blessed him, saying, "You whose name is Jacob, you shall be called Jacob no more, but Israel shall be your name." Thus he was named Israel. Now that's strange, right? That's strange, because this already happened. Jacob got the name Israel by wrestling the angel. He got it as a special blessing from this angel. He's already Israel. So why is God repeating this information? Well, it seems that there's some need to affirm that, or make it official, or acknowledge, or just to say, since you are Israel now you can really arrive at the house of God. Now you can really have this relationship. The last battle you went through is precisely what you needed in order to get to Bethel. Okay? So, and let's just finish what God says to Jacob there. And God said to him, "I am El Shaddai, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and then an assembly of nations shall descend from you. Kings shall issue from your loins. And the land that I assigned to Abraham and Isaac, I assigned to you and to your offspring to come. I will assign the land." And God departed from him at the spot where God had spoken to him. And Jacob said, here's another monument. Jacob set up a monument at the place where God had spoken to him, a monument of stone, and he offered a libation upon it and poured oil upon it. And Jacob called the place where God had spoken to him the name of Beth El. It's like, that's funny too, because Jacob's already called the place Beth El, and Jacob himself has already been called Israel. But it's like, all of this is like, it's like, okay, now we're going to have the ceremony where we actually, you get the certificate and you are Israel, and this is Beth El. And all of this is like happening as a kind of like a reifying, a reaffirmation of the journey that we've been heading through all along. Okay, so all very helpful. Irene.
Yes, and the other thing that I found interesting is that the background of this is that Jacob seems very tortured about his conflict with his brother. He's always very nervous. He went through a lot. Then he went to Shechem, and his daughter was assaulted, and then his sons make this. He's just very passive. Things are just happening for him. And he's like, what is this? My mom made decisions for me, everything. And so now he went through his a lot of traumas, right? Facing his brother, seeing his children react in a certain way. He's like, okay, now I got to take control. I got to be more active. I got to establish that this whole story, there was a purpose for it. And the reason why I had to take the blessing is because I had to live in this land, right? Like, how am I different than my brother? We have children. I have wealth, he has wealth, and then at the end we're hating each other for what? And the what is the land. And so he had to close it up to make all of this turmoil give it purpose and direction. And also for him to be able to say, I'm an actor in this story. I'm setting up the monument. I'm setting up the altar. I'm telling my family, please put the little idols away because this is not kosher here. We need to, start a new, fresh start. And also it helps for his family to understand, like, this is why we went through all this. That's why we had to separate into two groups. So we had to risk our lives because now we're here in Bethel. Now everything is okay.
Beautifully put. That is that's nice. As we kind of come towards a close here, Irene is doing a great job of kind of bringing all of this together, because whatever other significance we might assign to Jacob's time in Aram, it feels a little bit like a break, a long hiatus from Jacob's covenantal destiny, right? Like, what is the covenant about? The covenant is about having a special relationship with God and being on this land. From the start, that's what God is saying to Abraham, and then Isaac, and then presumably Jacob. But Jacob has to leave all that and is in another setting entirely for 20 years. Now, there are things that happen there. There's meaning to that, but there is a way in which Jacob is kind of off track or out of the covenant for 20 years. And so this return to the land is like, it's a return. It's like, it's a return to the role that Jacob was always destined to play, but has not been playing. Okay. So Jacob's been in exile and he's reclaiming the land, the God, the whole covenant Jacob is reclaiming at this point. And that's significant, of course, because Jacob's doing this in a particular way in his life. But of course, in the story of the Jewish people, there will be another great period in exile that eventually will be concluded with God's kind of call to come back to the land, okay, and to rebuild a house of God. So there's something in this, like, return to the house of God, return to the land, that is setting the stages for a larger cycle of exile and return. And as Irene puts it, it's a kind of, it's a reclaiming of this covenant that has been. Was Jacob fulfilling the covenant in Aram, or was he just sort of on hiatus? And that's one way to think about this period in Jacob's life and this return to becoming the person that he was destined to be. Okay. With that in mind, I want to just before we close, note one other reference to Beit El, and now that we've spoken about Jacob inheriting the covenant that Abraham inherited, it is true, actually, that Bethel was mentioned once before, very early on, in the first chapter of the Abraham story. Take a look at this. Abraham, let's see, passed through the land, right? God said, Lech Lecha, and Abraham went, and he wasn't Abraham then, he was just Avram. And he passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem. That's where Dinah was raped. Okay, so Jacob's just come from there. At the terebinth, there's that oak tree again of Moreh. And the Canaanites were then in the land. And God appeared to Avram and said, I will assign this land to your offspring. Very familiar. And he built an altar there to God who had appeared to him. And from there he moved on to the hill country east of Beit El and pitched his tent with Beit El on the west and Ai on the east. And he built there an altar to God and invoked God by name. Okay, all very familiar stuff. But look, Beit El is already a place that Abraham knows of. Now, I don't know, like, the commentators go crazy trying to figure out, is it all the same Beit El? Did Abraham name the place Beit El? Is Jacob just naming it when he gets there, or does he name it after? Like, how do we string all these things together? I don't think we have time to work all that out today, but I will just say that there is, you can see here, there's a history at Beit El, and it's a history that goes back to Abraham. And what did Abraham do at Beit El? He built an altar and he called God by name. Okay. And what is God asking Jacob to go do now? is to build an altar and to worship God at Bethel. That is not what Jacob did originally. Okay? Jacob did not, he had the dream. He said, this is amazing. This is the portal to God. And then he set a stone there to remember it and left. Okay? I'm not saying he did the wrong thing. I don't even know how to judge the sequence of events in Jacob's life, but there is something unfulfilled in Jacob's first encounter with Bethel. He doesn't build an altar. He doesn't really turn it into a house of God, as Abraham seemingly once did. And so this fits very nicely into what we've been saying. And so Jacob wasn't there yet. He wasn't at the level of Abraham, and maybe not at the level of Isaac. He wasn't ready to worship at the house of God. And even though his 20 years sojourn is a kind of hiatus, is a chaotic kind of time off of the covenant, there's another way in which it's only now that he's actually ready to enter the covenant. Because remember who he was then. He was a man who was fleeing from a brother and a father that he had tricked and manipulated, and he was just a young punk, right? And yet he had certain spiritual gifts, capacities, a spiritual destiny. He could dream of God. He could speak to God in his dreams, but somehow he wasn't able to fully actualize the covenant. And it isn't until everything he's been through, the struggle, the triumph, and the trauma, that Jacob somehow has gotten to a place where he is matured enough, or as Jen said, he has built enough of a community around him as well, that he's ready to go back to that house of God. So I think with that, we'll end here. And I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. And I will not see you next week. Rabbi Avi Strasberg will see you next week. And she's really special. I recommend you come. I'll see you. Shabbat Shalom.